Welcome to the Miscarriage Rebellion. I'm Sam Payne, CEO and co-founder of the Pink Elephant Support Network.
And I'm Stacey June Lewis, counsellor, psychotherapist and broadcaster. This podcast is where we share stories of many Australians who have lost their babies to early pregnancy loss.
With evidence and empathy, we unpack the shame, blame and stigma and the lack of support that many face. This is a loss that has been silenced for too long. We deserve better.
We are here to normalise the conversation.
And we're here to make lasting change. On today's episode, we bring you Maggie McDonald, a friend, an artist, a Pink Elephant's peer support companion. This story really got me. There's a lot in here about the lack of validation and the disenfranchised grief and how that can lead to exacerbated mental health outcomes. Again, these stories need to be shared. These experiences need to be highlighted so that we can change, so that we can meet women with the empathy and understanding they deserve. I really love how Maggie shares her decision not to try and have another baby, to fix the outcome, because that's what society normally assumes. There isn't a rainbow baby at the end of this story, but I still believe this story leaves you with a feeling of hope, a feeling of a way to move forward. Maggie exemplifies giving. She continues to give back to our community in many ways and be there for women like her who have gone through experiences of loss. It's a great story to share, and I'm really grateful that you're here to listen today.
If you could just share a little bit with the listeners about what your experience is, that would be great.
Yes, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here and to be able to share a little bit of my pregnancy loss journey, I guess. It's still a journey, still today. So I am 10 years past loss. I had 2 miscarriages at one at 9 weeks and one at 12 weeks. I have a son who was 5 at the time. He's now 14. Can't believe that, but yeah. And so my experience was I had a missed miscarriage at 9 weeks, which was found with, I guess, the pregnancy not progressing as it should have. And I ended up having a natural miscarriage at home. So I passed the baby, or as they like to call it, the products of conception at home, which was traumatic and very hard to deal with. I felt at the time that I was very unprepared for having to be at home and bleed at home and not really knowing what was expected of me in that time. I did end up, we decided to try again because at the time I felt like that would be the thing that would make it better and that would help me. And we tried again, and I'm really lucky. I have always fallen pregnant straight away and fell pregnant again 3 months after the first miscarriage, and was cautiously optimistic, but with pregnancy after any loss, it was very, very, very stressful and lots of anxiety that came with that. And everything was going really well. Had a little bit of bleeding at 8 weeks, did a scan, had seen the heartbeat, everything was okay. And then at our 12-week scan, I went into the ultrasound and was told that there was no heartbeat and that our baby had passed away a couple of days before. And it was probably one of the most confronting and shocking things I've ever been through. I don't know, those words don't really, as I can say all these words, but they don't really explain how you feel. I felt like the floor was like opening up underneath me. I remember my husband being there, and I remember them going, "Oh, go and empty your bladder, come back. We're going to have another look." And then the ultrasound technician had kind of said, "I'll be back. I'm going to go get someone to come and talk to you." And you kind of just lie in the bed and something's wrong. I remember just feeling so shocked that it happened a second time. And I was just thinking to myself, there's no way that the universe could be so cruel that it would do this to me, twice. And I know, I say this about my own losses, but I know of, so many women, have gone through this, multiple times, tens of times. And you kind of think to yourself, it can't be real. You cannot possibly be doing this to me again? And I remember us having planned to tell my son that day that I was pregnant and that he was getting a brother or sister, and we ended up just driving to like a park and sitting there, my husband and I, just going, we were just in shock. And then so, I ended up then having to go back, having just been told that my baby had passed away, go back to my obstetrician's office and sit in the waiting room to see him with all these heavily pregnant women around me. And I remember sitting there and I'd been crying and I just was like, I'm getting goosebumps just thinking about it. So they're sitting there going like, this is just it's a cruel joke, right? It was just so awful, and ended up seeing him. He was amazing, so beautiful, and booked me in for a DNC. And that was on the Friday. DNC was booked in on the Tuesday. So I had, this whole weekend ahead of me having to be at home waiting for this DNC and this baby inside me. It was just, it's just shock really. You don't really know how to deal with all of that. Lots and lots of tears. And on the Monday night, I was booked in to go on the Tuesday morning. I actually started going into labour at home and started going into labour and ended up having my baby in the toilet and actually getting up and looking, and like there was actually, my baby was in the toilet. So it was just so traumatic. And I remember at the time just thinking, okay, we've got to do something, and putting the baby in a container and making sure I've got that with me, and thinking, I've got to take this to the hospital. What do I do? And we were very lucky. We have an amazing private hospital close to us, and because I'd been booked in with them the next morning at the maternity ward, I actually rang them and said, what do I do? And they basically said, come in straight away. I'd lost a lot of blood by that stage and had started to hemorrhage, and so they admitted me straight away and did an emergency DNC. So everything just happened within 2 hours of me going into labour. So it was very fast, very traumatic. My poor husband was just trying to figure out what he's supposed to be doing. And then, kind of waking up in that hospital the next day, and you're in the maternity ward and you've just had a miscarriage and you've just had a DNC, and I've lost all this blood. They're thinking, do we do a transfusion? What do we do? And you're lying there and you're just kind of going, it's shock. It's just shock. And then your body has also gone through this trauma and you're just kind of there trying to get through, the next couple of hours, I guess. And then I remember having to leave the hospital with my husband and then walking through the maternity ward out of the hospital, because it's a very popular hospital for delivery, and there's just pregnant women coming in to have their babies, and I'm walking out and I've just lost my baby. It was literally like I said, I'm still now getting goosebumps talking about it. And what followed after that was just shock. I remember just being so shocked. I was so unwell because they had to give me emergency anesthetic. So I felt like I'd been in a car crash. I was in bed for about a week trying to recover from the DNC. And I think the thing that we forget about miscarriage or pregnancy loss is that it's not just, the mental trauma, it's the physical trauma. Very often our bodies have actually gone through this. There's a lot of the times there's a lot of blood loss. There's all of this stuff that happens when you lose a baby, and you've got your body having to try and to recover, and at the same time you've got this mental trauma and anguish that you're going through. So it was really tough, and I had amazing support. I had in-laws, my husband, people were sending flowers, and it was really lovely, but it was really at the same time just like a feeling of I had no idea how I was supposed to deal with this grief. It's just been, kind of it's like it's lumped on you. And what ended up happening was then you get through that initial physical trauma and you heal to a point, and you then go through the feelings of, the grief, and you're crying a lot. I remember crying a lot, watching a lot of really bad trashy TV and just crying. and trying to then, because my son was 5, he was about to start kindy, so having to get up and having to kind of look after him and make sure that you're just getting up and getting dressed and doing all those things. And people were beautiful, they were checking in and all of those beautiful things. But as the weeks went on, the grief stayed because there was nowhere for it to go. And the how are you going stopped, and it's got a little bit less. And for me, the biggest thing was like I felt like I wasn't allowed to grieve these babies, because it was obviously the 2 by that stage, because they were only 12 weeks. So how do you grieve a baby that was only 12 weeks, right? So I never had the validation. I felt so lost in the fact that I was so traumatized and so sad, and I felt like I wasn't allowed to be. And that was just this big thing, And then it was so we're moving into the mental health impact of this, is the fact that validation would have made a massive difference. But because there's no validation, you're feeling like you're not allowed to be grieving this baby, okay? So I wanted to do things like, kind of maybe you're thinking, oh, maybe I'll get a tattoo, maybe I'll do all these things. You Google and you go, oh, what people have done. And then you're like, no, but I can't, because like it's not that serious. Like it was only 12 weeks and people expect you to move on and move forward because it was only 12 weeks. It wasn't really a baby. You have a child, all of those things. And you tell yourself all of those things because that is what it's like what we like to tell ourselves, just so that we can actually justify things for ourselves. So that was, kind of my story with loss, and the mental health impact was severe. I ended up with complicated grief 6 months down the line. I've suffered with anxiety and depression my whole life. And I was very closely monitored before I had my son, because there was a big concern that I would get postnatal depression, which I did. But I was monitored. I had a social worker that came and checked on me. I had all these people in hospital checking that I was okay. I had a very, very complicated traumatic birth, but there was support afterwards, okay? With this, no support for me, right? So it was like you're just needing to kind of get on with it and kind of do things. So ended up with complicated grief 6 months down the line. I know now that's what it's called, but it was basically me physically and mentally not being able to function.
And when you say now what it was called, at the time, were there conversations, because you had been struggling with anxiety and depression prior? Did you have a support base in terms of a therapist or somebody you were working with then? And were you aware of those terms in those moments, or is this something that you've become aware of after working with Think Health and or later?
It's an interesting thing. So I knew something wasn't right, and that it had been triggered because of, I guess, the trauma, and also trauma from when my son was born, all these things, on top of each other. But at the time I was just thinking, it's just me with my depression. I've had it since I was 19. I'm just not able to cope. And this is something yes, it is because I lost a baby. I knew in my gut that is why I was not functioning properly and why I was so sad. But because I wasn't validated and I didn't believe that I should be still 6 months after the loss be feeling like this, I thought I was having a really major depressive episode. And so I have had an amazing GP all the way through, and I actually went and said, I am not coping, So, kind of went back on antidepressants and did all of those things. And at the time, even then, still didn't really get much validation of the fact that this is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is grief compounded with all of these things. Throw in mental health challenges and all these things that you live with. So I basically, started back on my antidepressants, and started, kind of doing the usual, started with a therapist, which was amazing, always have had an amazing psychologist, and just kind of tried to put one foot in front of the other. And for me, that was also I ended up having this crisis of like, it's almost was like a midlife crisis. It was like, okay, I've hit rock bottom. Like I felt like I nearly died. Like I lost all this blood. It was just, I reevaluated so many things in my life. And for me, at the time, the decision was like, are we going to have another baby? Are we going to keep trying? Because the obvious thing that everyone says to you is, oh, just try, just keep trying. Have another one. Just have another one and you'll be fine. And for me, I was so unwell mentally that I was too scared to do that. And in my gut, I knew that I had made my decision, but everyone else around me was trying to still, I guess, support me into maybe trying for another baby so that, which I understand. I mean, that's society's, that's your, like, let's fix this. We're going to fix it. Okay, like we're going to fix this, and the way that we fix this is by having another baby. And for me, that just wasn't. And my husband was like, "We are not having another baby," because he saw me at the worst, at the darkest time, and he's just like, "I cannot go through this again because I might lose you." And so I knew that, and I also was really worried that if I had to go through a miscarriage again, and there's no guarantee that I would have miscarried again, but the fear was there that I would maybe not come out the other side if I had another miscarriage and mentally I couldn't deal with it. So I made the decision. I'm saying me because ultimately it did come down to me making the decision with my husband's support that we will not keep trying and that we will not have another child. And it was probably the hardest decision I've ever made in my life. I still now, I'll tell you this, I now still, once a week, I dream that I'm pregnant. Full detail, everything. And at the time it was really tough because my son was 6 and he was starting kindy and everybody had a brother and a sister and he kept asking, brother and a sister. And he's 14 now and we have discussions about this because he knows everything that happened and he's just like, it's, this is our unit and, we're happy and, like it would have been fine if it was another one, but we're good, like I get it, which is amazing, So I think, and that's the other thing, like I had this beautiful child and I was like, if I am not functioning, if I'm literally like lying in bed and I cannot get up, I can't, do basic things and look after him, then what's the point of keeping trying and putting myself through this again? And it was a hard one. So I ended up deciding to study because I was trying to distract myself from having to make a decision about having another baby. And I was just like, this is what you do, right? So you're like, okay, I'm going to go and spend thousands of dollars, to go and, do something. But it was a good thing because it was actually a catalyst for me to decide I wanted to do something creative. I've always wanted to do that. And it was so healing because it was so much part of the journey. But it wasn't until, so with, like talking about that, knowing what to call these feelings, wasn't until I connected with Pink Elephants and I did the peer support training that I learned that complicated grief is the grief that it wasn't dealt with at the time. I was never told to feel your feeling. No. This is everything I know about the mental health impact of pregnancy loss I've learned through being a peer support companion and the training that I've done to do that.
Got a question around what happened with your mental health when you made that decision. So had your mental health started to somewhat regulate for you to make the decision, or was the decision a thing that helped with that? When I say regulate, I mean an equalism.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. I think it's both, but it definitely leans more towards the fact that I had made the decision. And pregnancy loss is such a out of control situation, right? So we all want to be in control. And that's the one thing I found, like this, I could not control any of this. And I couldn't control if I got pregnant, whether I was going to have a baby, if it was going to be another miscarriage. So I felt like I'd taken back a little bit of control. And my decision was a decision made based on my experience of my own mental health and, what I guess I had to look at my life in the future and with my child and my husband and us as a family unit. what is going to serve us the best. Because, I had visions of me in a mental hospital, like not being able to cope. And we don't want to be there. Like nobody wants to, be there. And I'm very open about the fact that I struggle with depression and it runs in my family and it's something that I deal with every day. And I don't think that, putting yourself in a situation just because that's what you think you should be doing or society is telling you what to do is the right way to go, if you know that you have these challenges. I feel like that's the thing. And so I controlled that kind of decision for myself,
Like I can understand that control element. I know that there's a lot of false narratives out there around obviously pregnancy loss, the lack of validation, how that perpetuates this disenfranchised grief. And then you're feeling like you want some control back, but because no one's validating the experience, it almost like exacerbates it and makes it worse and worse. I think what would be really interesting to kind of unpack now is that you took your experience, did the most beautiful thing and chose to give back to others as a peer support companion in Pink Elephants and to provide women with that validation that you never got. So it'd be really interesting to hear more about kind of how you feel that makes a difference in women's journeys and what kind of things you're still hearing today when you're providing peer support to women about that lack of validation.
That's absolutely it. It's like even like every single week when I speak to women, at the moment I'm doing live chat, every single week when I speak to women on live chat, it is the validation. It's about they're reaching out, they're going, I just need someone to tell me that what I'm going through is normal. And all we're doing is just saying it's okay for you to be feeling like this.
It's really interesting. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay.
Talked earlier about that. That having already a predisposition to potentially postnatal depression or other depressive episodes because of your background or your health, when I'm looking for history, it's interesting that instead of kind of really adding extra support, it almost worked against the extra support. It was like, well, this is because of the past as opposed to what is actually being experienced now. And that validation is generally not given a lot for a lot of miscarriage cases or when people lose their babies. But in this instance, it even kind of doubled up because it was now only we're not giving you validation, but we're going to tell you that it was because you already felt bad.
Yeah.
And so I can really feel how validation is important for people, but I can really feel extra why it must feel important to you.
Absolutely. And it's that thing of, she's already not. And myself, I was like, but I'm, like I said before, this is me, I've got depression and I struggle with things, sometimes. So this must just be because I am already, not 100% and I struggle with things. So that's why I am still crying 6 months down the line. So that whole thing of like I'm kind of, diminishing my grief and diminishing my experience because that is what I kind of have been told to believe about myself, and that's a really, really hard thing. So what I'm hearing from women reaching out to us is that they are number one in shock. So often we'll have someone, jump on live chat when they've literally just had a miscarriage and they've it's a day after or they're going through a miscarriage while you're talking to them. And it's that shock of this is happening, number one. And then the thing of like not knowing how they are supposed to be feeling and what they are allowed to be feeling. So nobody should be telling anyone else what they're allowed to feel when it comes to these things. But we do tend to be very, hard on ourselves. And, I'm not supposed to be feeling it's only 5 weeks, it's only 9 weeks. It's like a loss is a loss is a loss. We say that all the time.
So true. Just want to interject there with some research that really does underpin a lot of what you just said. Tommy's in the UK do a lot around the mental health impact of early pregnancy loss and a lot of advocacy there. It's great. I think it's really important that listeners hear this. There is absolutely no correlation or relationship between your previous experience of depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress. So yes, it can compound, but there's no direct correlation. It is not your fault you're feeling this way. And I think that's part of this problem, the silence around pregnancy loss and miscarriage and the lack of validation, that we internalize all of these feelings and we blame ourselves when it isn't something we've done. And there's a real danger in that, because then women don't get the help that they need and they deserve. And that's certainly exemplified in your story, right? The way that you share that 6 months later, you were still blaming yourself. And actually what you needed was someone to say, this is not your fault. It is okay to feel this way. And this is how we're going to be here for you.
And just because you felt sad before doesn't mean that it's a continued sadness. This is its own.
Absolutely. I believe firmly that if I had someone tell me when I went through those 2 miscarriages that I am okay to be feeling the way that I was feeling, and explain to me that these feelings of grief and loss are normal, that I would not have ended up 6 months down the line still trying to figure out why I was feeling like I was feeling, and trying to explain to my husband and everyone around me why I haven't moved on, or I was still crying about a baby that was 12 weeks old, 6 months before. That is my belief, and I think that's one of the reasons why I started doing peer support, because I just felt like we needed to be those people who, I wanted to be that person that would tell someone going through this that it is okay for you to be feeling what you're feeling. Okay, that is all we're doing. We're there to support. We are just, speaking to women, telling them that whatever it is that they are feeling is okay. Very often I'm like, I feel like I'm going crazy. You're not crazy. You're not. You're grieving the loss of your baby, and naming the fact that you've lost a baby, because the language around all of these things as well, from family members and from partners, and God love them, they don't know how to deal with this. It's 10 years down the line and people are still not comfortable with grief, and society, we just don't like talking about these things. So, it's unfortunately, in-laws and parents, the people with the best intentions, they don't use the right language. They don't want to name the fact that you've lost a baby. Sometimes people, like a woman, just saying to them, I'm sorry that you have lost a baby, in those words, that's all they need to hear. That's honestly, I get the feedback and it's thank you so much for just saying those words. And that's really, and that's what I'm saying, if somebody had done that for me, I think, the trajectory of my journey would have been so much, so different. It wouldn't have been amazing because, there's grief and everything that's going, but just validating.
We're not removing grief.
No.
Remove grief.
No.
But we always talk about 3 things that pink elephant system: validation, empathy, and connection. If you can remember those 3 things, validate the loss of a baby, empathize with the person who's going through it, and connect them to someone who can offer support, then you're going to make a huge difference into how that person is able to carry on and be able to go through this experience feeling supported, feeling like people are with them on the journey and they're not on their own and isolated, which we know compounds everything, makes everything so much harder.
So Maggie, obviously, if this is a long game, it's a forever game. But in those moments of really the big struggle, what were some of the tools or some of the things that you felt when you eventually got to them that supported you?
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I think if you look at pregnancy loss and the grief that you feel and the experience, it doesn't go away. It does change you. It sits with you for the rest of your life, I believe. And I'm looking 10 years after my losses now, and it's like it's faded. It's almost like it's a photograph. It's not it's not as bright, the pain. It kind of fades. And I still have times and days that very unexpectedly will just trigger feelings and things like that. And doing peer support as well, we often do have moments where you will get triggered because you kind of put yourself back into those situations. And then, in those instances, I tend to be very kind to myself. And I know we throw this around all the time. Be kind to yourself. Be kind to yourself. What does that look like? For me, that looks like having a really nice bath and watching really trash TV sometimes, right? So this is me. You go, be kind to yourself. everybody has a different way of dealing with it, so that's one side of it. I love spending time at the beach. For me, that's a reset. I do cold water swimming. And that's something that's helped me not just with, kind of, I guess, the grief from pregnancy loss, but also just with mental health in itself. And the other thing is I try to, I guess, reconnect with, why I'm doing what I'm doing with Pink Elephants. Very often that's something that will really put things into perspective for me as well, So I have a bit of a toolbox of stuff that helps me. I like to create, so I'm like, that's what I do. And I find that, kind of making things with my hands and painting, things like that actually really helps me. The other thing that these are little, kind of things that we discuss very often with peer support as well. It's, as much a mental health thing as it is, marking the loss as well. It's, writing a letter to your baby. It's journaling really helped me as well. And just basically writing down everything that I was feeling and thinking that I couldn't really say to many other people around me, because a lot of the stuff that we do discuss and that we talk about and that we walk around with is not something that you just discuss with anyone, kind of over a coffee, really isn't. So journaling was really good for that because it kind of got all those thoughts and feelings out onto a piece of paper. So it's, it's whatever works for you. I know some people go boxing to get that anger out. I remember doing a boxing class and crying pretty much through the whole boxing class. And my partner knew what was happening. She just let me go out and have a cry, come back in and keep boxing, and it was just that thing of, doing the things that help you. And even though at the time you might struggle to do them, it's just kind of trying to keep putting one foot in front of the other and use those tools that you've got in your toolbox.
So we have a thread question, if you like, that we ask all of our guests, and it is that idealistic world that if you could wave a magic wand for bereaved parents, if you could change one thing that would make a huge difference, what would that be?
So I had a bit of a think about this, and I remember having the social worker come and check on me when I had my son, and I feel like if we had a similar service or support service for bereaved parents, imagine having gone through, pregnancy loss and then straight away being connected with a support person that could literally just say to you, it's okay. This is what to expect, I feel, physically, and this is what to expect mentally, and whatever you're going to be feeling in the next couple of weeks, months, years even sometimes, it's normal and you're validated. That would be, it would just be amazing, because I feel like the mental health impact and the impact of, pregnancy loss would be such an amazing tool, to, minimize. It's not going to not be there, but just to have that support there, can you imagine that would be so, kind of being, referred by your GP or whatever it might be, and just the validation. Yeah.
Loops that.
Yeah.
Really loops that.
Yeah.
Also, kind of starting that journey of grief in a completely different way. It's just the honoring. Yeah.
In a space that's, this is a nurture space for your grief and for, and this is, and it would be just because we do have that focus. We have all these amazing support services for, parents, like postnatal depression, all of these amazing things in Pink Elephants. We're doing amazing work, but, can you imagine, having that support at the same level as the support that you have when you're actually having a baby, not, they're not the same things, but at the same time, it would be, Yeah,
I've heard it described as you leave hospital with a baby in your arms and you're given this wealth of support from physical pamphlets and packs to people constantly checking in on you. And yet we all leave hospital without our babies in our arms, through the maternity doors where everyone's big bumps and babies. And if that's not triggering enough, you're then left completely alone. So you get no support. And it's let's reverse that. Let's provide that early validation, and it's a check-in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and not waiting for it to get to a point for the check-in.
No.
Don't, yeah.
And then have, like this is the thing, have then women looking for support and having to go and look for support, which is what we're finding. You've got women having to go on Instagram or go on Facebook and find a support group for pregnancy loss because there is no one checking in on them. And that's where all our peer support calls and support comes from, because we haven't reached out to those women or those couples to support them. They've actually had to go and find us, and they've reached out to us to ask for help. So imagine if we could flip that the other way around.
Imagine the validation of a health professional saying, hey, we know this can be an incredibly traumatic experience. Here's where you go to for support. That difference that makes. It's permission to grieve at the very beginning. It's permission to feel what you feel, rather than what society tells you, which is, oh, you had a miscarriage. Oh, well, at least you know you can get pregnant. At least you can try again.
But I think this is what we really need to highlight. It's not just society. The system is not supporting. So the system is telling us that.
Yep.
That is the society.
Yep.
100%. The health care system.
Yep. Absolutely. And it's again, going back to, our beneficiaries, that with the women that we talk to every week, it is still the same. Like, we would like to think that we have done some amazing work in moving forward with this, and there are some amazing healthcare providers who are on board and are, worth their weight in gold. But the reality is that most, women are not getting that support at their hospital, at their GP, at wherever it is that they are going. So that's, it's still happening. And so once we, until we can fix that,
until we don't have women waiting in emergency departments that have passed their baby in plastic Ziploc bags in 2023.
Yeah.
And that made the media because that woman chose to share her story. But I know through Pink Elephants, we can probably find 2 to 3 women a week with a very similar story. Until that stops, until everything else in terms of the fact of women walking without support, being left alone, we're nowhere near done. We've shifted the dial a little bit, but there is still so much work to be done in this space to meet women and partners where they need to be met.
And how dare you ask a woman to be the person to advocate for herself in that moment? How dare you wait for someone to be brave enough to stand in front of the press? It's not good enough.
No, not good enough.
Yeah.
People don't talk about it, but it's happening. Behind closed doors, hidden behind smiling faces. There are so many people suffering in silence right now, unable to access the support that they need and deserve, simply because they don't even know that there is support available. The Pink Elephants community is made up of people from all over Australia. Some come from the big smoke, others from the bush. Some of us have heaps of friends and family around, others have none. Some have lost babies at 5 weeks. Some had ectopic pregnancies. Some had multiple ultrasounds. Others only ever saw the 2 red lines on a positive pregnancy test. But we all have something in common. We have all lost a baby. We are all bereaved parents. There are estimated to be over 100,000 of us across Australia every single year. Please help us connect with these people to give them the support that they deserve. No one should have to lose a baby and be left on their own to navigate their grief. Help Pink Elephants support more bereaved parents. Visit pinkelephants.org.au.
I found this really hard to hear. I think possibly because I'm close to Maggie and I know Maggie personally, and also because a lot of her story of losses relates so closely to my own. But what I really want to talk about here are 2 things. The first is the complete lack of validation and empathy that led to this perpetuation of disenfranchised grief, this isolation, the not reaching out for support, and then that double thing of blaming herself because she's mentally not okay. It's her fault that she's not coping because she has a history of anxiety and depression, rather than being given the acknowledgement that no, this is hard and difficult. And no matter what your history is, you're entitled to grieve your baby, and it's okay if you need support. And because she didn't have that, she ended up with this incredibly difficult mental health challenge. I'd love to on that.
I think it's really important to start with just identifying that mental health doesn't create infertility. Infertility often creates mental health issues. That's not to say in Maggie's case, she had certainly experienced mental health issues prior to trying to conceive. And so I think there is a real complex conversation here because she may have presented with anxiety or different types of mental health concerns prior, there's almost this assumption that was what kind of led into some of the complex situations around her infertility, around her losses, and then also the way that she dealt with them. But I really want to be clear here. Infertility does exacerbate or create mental health issues. There are plenty of people that walk the world and, I don't know many of them personally, but live, with no anxiety and a fairly carefree life. And then they move into this realm. They move into these infertility issues or start to have losses. They have one loss even. And there are repercussions. There are symptoms that come from that medical issue, which it is a medical issue. It's not a personality issue. So I just want to really reiterate that whatever you're experiencing as a symptom of your pregnancy loss or your infertility is a symptom, and I think we really need to get better at identifying these as medical issues, whether it's mental or physical, and understanding that they aren't you as an identity, they aren't you as a person, that they may not have been there before this and that they now may be there because of this. And acknowledging that in itself can often be one of the very first steps at being able to start to accept and grieve this new life that you've found yourself in. And I just wanted to really say that to anybody listening that has heard Maggie's story and has started to feel a bit confused as to when this started, when my mental health started to deteriorate. It doesn't matter, but it is also really important to acknowledge that infertility or pregnancy loss does, the research is there and I see it in my own practice, affects your mental health. How can it not?
Well, no, absolutely. And I remember asking myself those questions as well, trying to kind of join the dots and work out when I'd started feeling anxiety and it to the losses, because I'd been told that a miscarriage is something you just get over. So almost like questioning myself. And I feel like that's really common. Another part that's really strong with Maggie's story that needs the spotlight shining on it is those women that choose not to try and conceive again, that choose not to put their heart online again and risk having another loss and knowing that they might not want to go through everything they've been through. And that's an incredibly difficult choice to make. And I want that acknowledged. But what I really love about being able to share this story now with Maggie is years later from making that choice, how her life has built meaning around that. And she's come to a place of peace with that. I mean, she still talks about things like having dreams about being pregnant. That's still now a reality for her. But I feel like we often talk so much about the rainbow baby and that so many women will go on and have another baby as if that's the magic fix and the magic heal. And we know that that's not the magic fix and the magic heal, but we put a lot of focus on that. And I feel like what we don't shine enough of a spotlight on is those women that choose not to try again and don't have a rainbow baby. Yeah, I'd love your thoughts around that.
I think we are having a conversation about grief, except sometimes that grief doesn't have a symbol. It doesn't have this particular picture. It doesn't have this particular figure. It doesn't have this physicality. And so when you stop, it's almost like we assume that the grief stops, or because you're not grieving potentially even a 7-week loss, a 20-week loss, or the loss of a failed fertility round. Those things, even though they feel so invisible, they still are a conversation point, a figure that we can place to some of the grief. as difficult as they can be, because they're also not necessarily this kind of human person in front of us. However, then there's this other layer of grief that happens around the time where there isn't necessarily a figure. You're left with a decision and you're left with a nothingness. And that grief really does fall to these ideas, these dreams, these stories. We are told to be mothers from the time that we are 2 or 3. We play with dolls, we create stories about our future, we create stories and these dreams about what it would look like. It doesn't matter if you've had 1 child or 2 children, and you still find that there's grief after you choose to stop after that, because it wasn't your choice. So I think grief stays. This conversation of when that decision is to stop, it stays. It stays with you just as it would if you were to lose a loved one that you met, because we now have had something taken away from us that we felt very connected to and very much ours. That was our dream, our journey, our purpose, our identity, our vision, our hope.
Yeah. And it's that, and I love the diagram, and we'll link to it again in the show notes, but the grief ball and how we grow around grief. So the ball's still there, the grief's still there. We just grow with coping strategies on how we move forward. And I think that's really powerful for a conversation like this as well. And I love the fact that we've done that. We've kind of intentionally acknowledged that not everyone goes on and has a rainbow baby, and those stories deserve to be shared as well. So anyone, as always, if you need support, there are communities for you. That's why Pink Elephants exist. Everything is linked in the show notes. You are not alone on these journeys and experiences. And we're here to provide that validation and empathy for you and connection.
Yeah. Thanks for listening.
Today's episode may have brought up some feelings for you that you need some support around. That's totally okay. Head to pinkelephants.org.au to find access to our circle of support, your safe space where you can be met with empathy and understanding throughout all of your experiences of early pregnancy loss. We're here for you. You are not alone.
If you enjoyed listening to the Miscarriage Rebellion, please help us by leaving a 5-star review wherever you listen to podcasts. The Miscarriage Rebellion is a Pink Elephants podcast produced by our friends at 3P Studio.